Welcome to Cat Has Questions, curiosity, stories, and the strange corners of everyday life. Hello, I'm your host, Kat, and today's episode is one of those stories that does not just creep you out, it settles into your brain like a splinter and refuses to leave. Because this isn't just who did it, this is what the hell is happening in that house. This is the Hinterkaifeck murders, Germany's most infamous unsolved case, where 6 people were killed on a remote farm in Bavaria in 1922. And the scariest part is what happened before anyone died. Picture this, it's late winter in rural Germany, the kind of cold where everything feels muted, like the world is holding its breath. You live on a farm that sits apart from the village, no street lights, no neighbors right next door, just fields, trees, and the sounds of animals in the dark. And one morning, you step outside and you see it. Footprints in the snow. They come from the edge of the woods and they lead straight to your house. You follow them with your eyes because, of course, you would, and your stomach drops when you realize something. There are no footprints leaving, just arriving. Now, maybe you tell yourself it's nothing. Maybe you tell yourself it's a traveler, a drunk, somebody who got lost. But then weird things start happening. You hear footsteps above you in your attic. You check, you don't find anything. A newspaper shows up that nobody remembers ordering. Tools go missing and then reappear. And the more you try to brush it off, the more it starts to feel like the truth you don't want to say out loud. Someone has been inside your home. Not to steal, not to vandalize, just to be there. And then one night, the entire family goes silent. No one goes to church, no one shows up to work, and no one answers the door. And when the neighbors finally force their way inside, they find 6 bodies. And signs that whoever killed them did not run. They stayed. They ate. They fed the animals. They used the fire. They lived in the house with the dead. Yes, I hate it already here too. This is the Hinterkaifeck murders. So let's set the scene, because the setting is basically a character in this story. We're in Bavaria, Germany, about 70 kilometers north of Munich. I do not know kilometers, so I don't know how far that is. Near a small town called Weidhofen. And the farm at the center of this case is commonly known as Hinterkaifeck. Now, real quick, Hinterkaifeck wasn't exactly the official address the way we think of addresses now. It's more of like that farm behind Kaifeck, like an old school landmark name. And it's isolated. It's rural, it's quiet. The kind of place where if something happens in the night, you have a long time to think about it before help can arrive. And in 1922, help wasn't necessarily just like a quick call away. There's no instant police response, no security cameras, no Ring doorbells, just, whatever's outside. And on this farm lived 6 people. Andreas Gruber, who was 63, his wife Kazilla, who was 72, their widowed daughter Victoria, who was 35, Victoria's daughter, also named Kazilla, who was 7, Victoria's son Joseph, 2, and their new maid Maria, who is 44. And I want you to remember that last part, new maid, because she had just arrived and she would be dead within 1 day. So the Gruber family had a reputation in the area. And I'm going to keep this respectful because these are real people who died in a horrific way. But the reality is, neighbors talked. One of the reasons this case feels so unsettling is because there were whispers of dysfunction in this household long before the murders. Andreas, the father, was described as strict and controlling in many retellings. Victoria, the adult daughter, who was widowed, her husband, Carl, had reportedly died during World War I, though, like many wartime deaths at that time, details were not always crystal clear to the community. She lived back on the farm with her parents and her children after her husband died. And then their children, so 7-year-old Kazilla and 2-year-old Joseph, who should have been the bright spot in the story. And instead, they become part of why this case hits people so hard. Now, here's a detail that matters for atmosphere. The family had employed a maid before Maria, and the previous maid had left months earlier suddenly. And the reason that circulates again and again was that she left because she said the house felt haunted, that she heard strange noises, particularly from the attic. And I know every old house has noises. Even new houses have noises. But when you stack that on top of everything else that happens, it starts to feel less like creaky boards and more like someone was living up there. And then on the afternoon of Friday, March 31st in 1922, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived at Hinterkaifeck. Her sister escorted her to the farm and then left. And that is believed to be one of the last confirmed sightings of anyone alive on the farm. So, some warning signs. This part kind of makes my skin crawl. In the days leading up to the murders, multiple strange things were reportedly noticed around the property. One of the most famous details is the footprints that I was describing to you. Footprints in the snow leading from the woods to the house, with no matching prints leading away. Now, depending on the source, some details differ. This case has a lot of retelling and a lot of folklore layered into it. But the theme that is consistent is someone had been approaching the house. Then there were sounds within the house. Andreas reportedly mentioned hearing noises in the attic, which it also sounds like that previous maid was too, that they had heard footsteps above them. Something that suggested movement where there shouldn't be movement. And then the tools. Remember that tools were reportedly missing and then just showing back up? Which is honestly worse than them just being stolen, because at least if they're stolen, you can be like, okay, someone took them and left. But disappearing and reappearing feels like a message, or that person is just very comfortable in your space. And then there's also the eerie story of a newspaper appearing that no one remembered subscribing to. Again, a commonly repeated detail in the case's history. And if you're the kind of person who is rational, like me, or just maybe pretending to be rational, you want to explain it away. Oh, maybe someone delivered it to the wrong house. Maybe it blew in. Maybe someone just accidentally set it down. But if you're living alone on a remote farm, you already feel weird vibes about the attic, you see footprints at your door, and tools are moving around, the newspaper is not just one coincidence. That newspaper is proof someone else is in your orbit. And what gets me is, if these warning signs were happening, why didn't they leave? And I think the answer is, in 1922, people didn't live like us. You couldn't just pack up and go to a hotel. You didn't just call your friend and crash for the weekend. This farm was their livelihood, and denial is powerful. Also, to be fair, most people can't just afford to move. Let's be real. But the question remains, were these warning signs that the killer was testing the house? Or was someone just already living there? Because the attic detail comes back later in the worst possible way. So the night of the actual murders. They are believed to have happened on the night of March 31st, 1922. And what investigators later pieced together is chilling because it suggests something methodical. Not chaotic, not like a panicked moment. It appears that several of the victims were lured, one by one, out to the barn area. And there, they were killed with a tool called a mattock. It's a heavy farm tool, kind of like a pickaxe-adjacent tool used for digging. The victims believed to have been killed in or near the barn were Andreas, Kazilla, so the mom and dad, Victoria, their daughter, and then the little girl, Kazilla, so the 7-year-old girl. So all of them were believed to be murdered in the barn. And then inside the house, the killer went for the last two. Maria, the maid, who had only been there for one day, and Joseph, the 2-year-old. I'm going to keep this non-graphic because you don't need gore to feel how wrong this is. The horror is in the sequence. The horror is the idea that people were likely drawn out one at a time, meaning whoever did this had control over the moment. It wasn't like a panic, rage-filled murder spree. Like, they methodically called those people out there and also killed innocent children. And the weapon, the mattock, was later reportedly found on the property in the barn loft, which means the killer didn't just flee in a frenzy. They left it like they didn't care, like they knew they were safe. And after the murders, something happened that elevates this from unsolved crime to I'm never sleeping again. Because in the days after the murders, investigators and neighbors noticed signs of normal life continuing at the farm. Animals were being fed, the fireplace had been used, food had been eaten, and the bodies weren't discovered immediately. They were discovered on April 4th, 1922, after neighbors became concerned because the family hadn't been seen in several days, and the little girl hadn't shown up to school. So neighbors went over to check on them. People did not treat it like a modern crime scene. I mean, it wasn't modern times, so that makes sense. But multiple people walked around the property. They looked, they touched things, they moved things. And yes, it makes investigators today want to scream into a pillow. But at the time, the priority was like, is this family okay? Where are they? And what they found was, no, they were not okay. 6 dead. And evidence suggesting that the killer had remained on the property for a period of time after, often cited as about 3 days, living among the bodies. That detail alone is one of the reasons this case has never loosened its grip on people. Because you can almost handle the idea of a killer who panics and runs, which can we really though? But a killer who stays, who does chores, I mean, who feeds the animals but like kills a 2-year-old? That's insane. Because evidence suggests that whoever committed these murders did not flee the scene. They stayed. In the days following the killings, neighbors noticed something that didn't make sense. The farm animals were still being fed. The cattle were cared for. The barn showed signs of routine use. Inside the house, the fireplace had been tended. Food had been eaten. Daily life, or something that looked disturbingly like it, had continued. And remember, this wasn't discovered immediately. The family weren't found for several days later, when concern finally grew too loud to ignore. Which means that for a stretch of time, often cited as around 3 days, someone was moving through the farm after every member of the household was already dead. Walking through the same rooms, using the same tools, passing the same bodies day after day. And what makes this more unsettling is how comfortable those actions seem. That doesn't read panic. It doesn't read like someone scrambling to escape. It reads like routine. Like someone who knew how the farm operated, who understood which animals needed feeding and when, who knew how to keep the property running without drawing attention. Some accounts even suggest that food was prepared or eaten inside the home, though details vary depending on the source. But the core idea remains the same. The killer didn't just linger, they lived there. And when you let that sink in, the case takes on an entirely different shape, because it raises a question that investigators could never answer. Was the murderer hiding after the crime, or had they already been hiding before it? If someone was already familiar with the house, the attic, the barn, the rhythm of daily life, then staying afterward wouldn't feel like a risk. It would feel natural. And that's the part that refuses to leave people alone. Not that the killer was bold enough to stay, but they may have felt at home. And if that's true, then Hinterkaifeck wasn't invaded. It was already occupied. And it brings us back to the warning signs, because if the killer stayed after the murders, how sure are we that he wasn't already there before? So the investigation. Police investigated, people were questioned, theories flew around town, but the case was messy from the start, partly because the scene had been disturbed before authorities arrived. You know, when they were checking around, making sure that they were okay, which they clearly were not. And there's no shortage of names on the suspect list, but there's also no smoking gun that held up strongly enough to close the case. So here's the part every true crime story promises, and the part this case refuses to deliver. Because despite investigations, interrogations, and over a century of speculation, the Hinterkaifeck murders remains unsolved. There is no confession, no DNA, no final answer, only theories. And each one answers some questions while creating brand new ones. So let's walk through the most discussed possibilities, not to pick a winner, but to understand why none of them fully work. We can kind of pick a winner if we want. So theory number 1 is the neighbor, Lorenz Schultenbauer. If you've ever read about this case before, this is probably the name you've seen the most. Lorenz was a neighbor and someone with personal ties to the family. Depending on the source, he is portrayed anywhere from mildly suspicious to basically guilty. Here's what raises eyebrows. Lorenz was involved in the discovery of the bodies, and accounts say he entered the farm, walked around, and may have even moved things before authorities fully secured the scene. Now, as we mentioned, this is 1922. Crime scene protocol was not even a thing yet. So behavior that feels shocking to us today wasn't necessarily seen as sinister at the time. But still, Some later retellings describe Lorenz as oddly calm. Others point to inconsistencies in his statements over the years. There have also been rumors, and I want to be clear that these are rumors and not proven facts, that he may have had a complicated personal relationship with Victoria. And that opens up the door to speculation about motive. And remember, Victoria is the adult daughter. But here's the problem. There is no concrete evidence tying Lorenz to the murders. No physical proof, no reliable confession, no moment where everything clicks cleanly into place. And over time, historians have pointed out that Lorenz may have become the default suspect simply because he was available. He was alive, he was nearby, and he couldn't definitively prove what he didn't do. And that makes him easy to blame. So while this theory persists loudly, it's far from airtight. Another theory goes much darker and much closer to home. This one suggests the murders were committed by someone within the family, or someone deeply entangled in its private conflicts. The Gruber household was reportedly strained, as I had mentioned. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, had a reputation, again, based on historical accounts and neighbor testimony, that he was controlling and difficult. There were whispers of long-standing dysfunction behind closed doors. And in cases like this, it's tempting to believe that something simmered for years until it finally exploded. But here's the issue. This theory struggles with logistics. Because if this were a family-driven crime, it doesn't explain why everyone died, why the killings were carried out so methodically, or why someone would remain on the property afterward, feeding animals and living among the bodies. Family violence is often chaotic, but this was controlled. And more importantly, there's no evidence that any one family member survived long enough to be responsible for all of it. So while internal conflict may explain tension, it doesn't convincingly explain the crime itself. So the next theory is a robbery or random intruder. At first glance, this feels like the simplest explanation. An intruder, someone passing through, someone looking for money or supplies. But simplicity doesn't mean accuracy, because nothing about this crime screams robbery. Valuables weren't taken. Money was reportedly left behind, like they had money in their wallets. And most random attackers don't lure victims one by one, stay for days afterward, or comfortably navigate a property without being detected. This wasn't a smash and grab. This required patience, familiarity, and time, which makes a completely random intruder unlikely. Okay, and then this is the theory that keeps people up at night, and it's the one that I personally cannot shake. The idea that someone was already on the property, living in their attic before the murders ever happened. Think about it. The footsteps in the attic, footprints leading to the house but not away, tools disappearing and reappearing, the maid quitting because she felt like she was being watched and that it was haunted. And then after the murders, someone stays to feed the animals, uses the fire, moves through the house without any sort of urgency. That feels like someone who knows the rhythms of the farm, who knew when people slept, who knew where tools were kept, who knew how to remain unseen. Now, is this theory provable? No. There's no direct evidence that someone was secretly living in the attic. But there's also no explanation that fully rules it out. And when you stack all the strange details together, this theory doesn't feel far-fetched. It feels plausible, terrifyingly plausible. And then there's the hardest possibility, and that's the truth of what happened at Hinterkaifeck died with the people who lived there. That the crime scene, contamination, the passage of time, the limitations of early 20th century investigation erased the answers forever. That the killer walked away and blended back into the world, started a new life, maybe had a family, lived out their days without consequence. And that thought, more than any suspect, is what makes this case linger. Because someone did this, someone knew the house, someone understood the silence, someone felt comfortable enough to stay. And whoever it was, they were never held accountable. So when people ask, who do you think did it? My honest answer is that I don't know. But I think the scariest part isn't who, it's how close they were and how long they were there before anyone even realized it. Here's what gets me too, though. A lot of true crime cases leave you with one big question. Who did it? But Hinterkaifeck leaves you with something worse. It leaves you with the question, how long was someone inside that house before anyone knew? Because if the family really did hear noises in the attic, if there really were footprints to the door, if things were really shifting around on the property, then the most terrifying part of this story isn't the night of the murders, it's the nights before. If it's the idea that the threat wasn't outside, but they were already inside. And I don't know what's more unsettling, that the killer was a stranger who watched and waited, or that the killer was someone the family knew, someone close enough to lure them, to move through the farm without fear, and to stay afterward for 3 days, and then just vanish back into normal life. Because somebody did this. Somebody lived through it. Somebody went on with their life like nothing happened. In the farm itself, Hinterkaifeck was eventually torn down, but the story certainly did not die with it. Because the question still hangs there in the cold. Who was in that house? If you made it through the end of this episode, I'm genuinely proud of you. If you want more cases that feel like something is not right in this place, make sure you follow the show so you don't miss next week. And if you're feeling extra brave in this episode, send this to a friend who loves mysteries. As always, I'm your host, Kat, and I will see you next week. Thanks for listening to Kat Has Questions. If you liked this episode, follow the show and share it with someone who loves a good spiral. See you next week.